The basic process that we're teaching you and that's required is a facilitative mediation process. So that's what we'll be talking about. As we do in all of our formal presentations, I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional owners and custodians of country and recognise their continued connections to the land, waters and culture of Australia, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I come to you from Gamaikura country over in East Gippsland in Victoria. We've already done our introductions. What I'm really wanting to do is a fairly nitty-gritty view of the process. One of the powers of mediation is that it is quite a structured process, and there's a lot of psychology built into the journey we take people on as mediators. I talked a little bit before about it being facilitative mediation. On either end of the spectrum, there's more transformative approaches, and on the other end of the spectrum, more evaluative. Some transformative, narrative, probably a less structured process, where the evaluative, the mediator tries to maintain that independent role. This is a big picture of the roadmap people take as they go through the process from the initial entry. So those of you that are in workplace type contexts, there's probably going to be some notice of dispute or something like that will initiate the process. That there's always a requirement that there's a pre-mediation with people. So some sort of preparation for mediation, and also make sure that it's appropriate. And that's something, if you're working independently, think about getting those procedures in place. And you'll find in your course files area, there's some example documents that you'll be able to use if you like to get started on that. But if you look at the standards, and you'll have that information in the course, there is some mandatory information we need to provide about confidentiality and the exceptions, and ensuring we have an appropriate process. Hopefully we get down to mediation and facilitating the process. Most practical training under the standards is around the mediation process, but we are doing a session on pre-mediation as well. So if you haven't got that booked in as yet, that's something that we need to get organised with you. And then we need to think about the ethics of what information that we're providing after our mediation process. So if you're in a people and culture or HR type role, you may have a process where there is a check-in. Otherwise, it might be a check-in with others. Nothing at all, just hope that people follow up and do what they said they would do. In other situations, they may want to make whatever they've agreed legally enforceable and get orders or a contract made. This is an overview of the process. The middle part, the exploration, exploring the needs, private sessions, and then going on to negotiation, that's really the body of the process. If you're thinking about your time management, it's more than 1/3 of the process. It's really spending the time, because if you do a good exploration, you can try and get people to understand each other, then you're going to find that the rest will kind of flow quite well. So with these first stages, in your course, you'll find some example documents, a run sheet, and the assessment tool. Has everyone had a chance to find those documents? So from the point of view of the assessment process, are you seeing the assessment tool, the feedback tool?
Yes, we are.
Joanne, I'm a little bit lost. Do we find these in the file section of the module? Okay.
No, he's in NMAS, Joanne.
Yeah, it's still in the section, so it might appear slightly different, but it's basically the same.
So it's called.
So
Sorry,
files is under modules, like on that site.
Yeah, or the other way that you can find these is if you go to the tasks and look at the role play as a mediator, it's got links to the documents that you'll need to use as well. So that makes it a little bit easier. But yeah, it'd be great if you get those. We've updated a little bit with the Andros course. We've kind of got the process skills by the stages of the process. And then the facilitation skills around, at this very high level, is your role to support agency, self-determination and informed decision-making. So basically not making decisions for clients or allowing them to be coerced, facilitating a fair process, managing the time available appropriately, facilitating the dispute process competently, demonstrating mediator skills. The particular skills we're looking at are active listening, appropriate and effective questioning, reflections, reframes, control over the process, and so on. There are other skills, like even using silence is a skill that we have as mediators to manage the process. Managing risks to fairness, safety and abuse of process, meeting ethical, professional, legal obligations, and providing process information and guidance where appropriate. The tool goes into more detail about how we do those things. In your course, there's a lot more information about all of the skills and how they're used. And then in the role play, that's where you're getting the feedback and support. For example, we had a scenario where one party was the manager and the other was an employee in the organisation. At each stage, the manager would jump in and say, so the mediator's like, who'd go first? And the manager's like, oh, he can go first. And then the mediator just immediately went with the other person going first, rather than, checking in. And that happened pretty much every time. The manager was being a bit naughty in the way he was behaving, but the mediator didn't realise or didn't pick up or that sort of thing. So as a mediator, we'd be checking in with both parties. And the same issue occurred in writing up the agreement. The manager was dictating the terms of the agreement and the mediator was writing it down and not checking in with the other party. So that would definitely not be even-handed facilitation. Does that make sense? Yep. Thanks. So what we're really wanting to make sure in those opening statements is that you're explaining your role, the role of the parties, any limits to confidentiality, the mediation process and behavioural expectations, and getting agreement from the parties. Now, in context, you will have discussed this in pre-mediation. So what you're doing is refreshing people's memory around those behavioural expectations, getting their agreement. If you need to hold them to account, then you've got that commission. The facilitation skills that you're working on is establishing rapport, speaking very clearly and concisely at the level of the participants, using check-in questions and other engagement skills to keep people engaged. So you're not doing a giant monologue without checking in. You can have a look at the run sheet. I'd encourage you to go through, update them into what feels comfortable for you. And then after your first role play as a mediator, you might want to update it again. And I tend to think of it like training rules on a bike. If you ever used those when you were little, you had 3 wheels at the back at the beginning because they're right down on the ground, and then just kind of gradually lift them so that you might just have the dot points or a little bit expanded rather than a whole script, if that makes sense, as you have more practice sessions. And of course, getting agreement to the ground rules. Here, as I said, there's that script which goes into much more detail, but it can be fairly overwhelming if you're trying to work with that. Any thoughts or questions about those mediators' opening statements? Yeah, and because it's fairly scripted, it's not too difficult to do, but be mindful of contextualizing. So if your scenario is workplace, you'll be talking about that context. If it's a neighbour dispute, it's going to be different people or different involvement. And then the parties' opening statements. So what we're wanting to do with that, in a lot of these early stages, we're using our transitions, we're using our invitations about who's going first to try and get a feel for the interaction between the people. My preferred approach is with the parties' opening statements is just invite who would like to go first, check in with the other person to see if they agree. Sometimes people will go with the applicant. You've asked for this mediation, so I'd like you to go first. It can work in some contexts. In other contexts, maybe it's the workplace that's asked for the mediation and neither of them is particularly sure about why they're there. Whoever feels like they've got something to say to go first, as long as the other agrees, is usually good. And we want to frame that around asking them to clarify what the issues they'd like to resolve. And what we're looking for in your facilitation skills, effective use of active listening and clarifying questions, maintaining your neutrality by using reported speech, maintaining control over the process, and using your mini and final summaries to identify the issues. And I think it was you, Sergio, you picked up in an observation that the mediator had sort of said, oh, when the behaviour was abusive or something along those lines.
Yes. What I noticed is the mediator then said, well, when that person was aggressive to you or abusive, then what happened? So it almost implying that they accepted the proposition that there was aggression.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why we need to use reported speech. So we'd say something when that behaviour that you felt was aggressive, or when you described the behaviour as aggressive, how did you respond to that? How did you feel when that happened? Something like that. Because otherwise the other person's sitting there saying, well, mediator's fallen for it. It's not going to be, it's no point. You can have someone check out straight away if we're not careful with that. So we're always acting as if we're a reporter, we're clarifying what people have said, but it's not coming out of our mouths, that thing, as if it sounds like we're saying that they were abusive or they were aggressive. Does that make sense? Has anyone got any questions about that? It's a different form of speech, mainly used just in mediation. The other area that sometimes people are confused about is active listening. So when we're talking about active listening, we're talking about listening to what people are saying, but checking in that you've understood. So one of the things that we're really trying to uncover are assumptions. And we need to do the same with our own. We can model that behaviour as well. So during the party's opening statements, we're showing them how to do active listening. We're showing them how you check in to make sure you've understood what someone said before proceeding. Or someone might say, they were just abusive towards me. And you think, okay, so you said that you felt that the behaviour was abusive. Could you provide an example of the sorts of things that have happened? You might be thinking, wow, maybe they've physically assaulted them or something. And the person said, well, if we come out of the house at the same time, they don't even say hello. That's just abusive. The meaning of word can vary enormously from person to person. When we're using active listening, we're checking in, we're seeking to understand, doing summaries and making sure that what we've summarised is correct. Personally, I prefer to do lots of little summaries as I'm going along, because that means I don't have to try and remember a whole pile of stuff and make notes. If you're busy making notes, then you're kind of not listening. As a mediator, we're not taking very many notes during the mediation session. We're just kind of writing down some keywords as we go along. Does that all make sense? I will share again. All of this busy work that we've been doing, our reflective language and checking in with parties, making sure that we've got an understanding. At the end of the first person, we'll do a summary and check if there's any other issues. If not, then we'll thank the other person, and move on to the other person and repeat the process. So we want to try and give them roughly the same amount of time. It's not always possible because one person's likely to talk a lot more than the other, but we give them the opportunity, check in, are there any more issues? So while you've been doing this, you're thinking, oh, what's the agenda going to be? Once we've gone through both of them, we want to make sure we don't start a discussion happening here. So, we wouldn't go back to party one and say, now that you've heard party two, is there anything else you wanted to add? We're wanting to try and get through this process pretty cleanly and efficiently. Usually when we're writing up the agenda, we start by, let's bring this across so it should come in. Party's opening statements, I've gone through that and the things that we're wanting to do. Probably the only other thing is we want to make sure that we're enforcing those behaviour protocols. This is an opportunity for you to show that you control the process The parties control the content, but you control the process. So we don't want to, you might think, oh, they're talking, so it's all good. That, no, we don't want them to be talking directly at the moment. We want to kind of keep the process flowing until we're ready to move on to forming the agenda and those reporting speech and summaries. So
you have heard a lot of the things before in the pre-mediation, but it's a chance for them to hear each other as well.
it's a chance. Yeah, and sometimes things have changed since the pre-mediation. Generally, we wouldn't start with a pre-agreed agenda. In some forms of mediation, that does happen. Sometimes in workplace or other contexts, but generally, no. Generally, it's done in this way. And it's the opportunity you'll find as you're sitting in role plays and you've got yourself in character, you're hearing things from the other point of view that you may haven't. Sometimes you don't hear it when the person's saying it, but when the mediator says it, it can, oh, okay, we can hear a little bit better. So that's kind of what that purpose of that party's opening statements is.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah. Now we've got the challenge of trying to bring that together into a mutual agenda. We're wanting to explain the agenda concepts in a way that's mutual, so it's relevant to both parties, which sometimes it's pretty easy to do that because they're talking about the same sort of issue, the computer system in one of the workplace scenarios. They might both be talking about it, but in other situations, only one person raises it. So you've got to think as the mediator, how is this relevant to the other person? How am I going to frame that so I can get that agenda item, which I think is pretty important, onto that agenda and, make it clear that it's relevant to both people. We wouldn't normally want to have one person's agenda item. The other thing we do want to do is explain them, write them up in no particular order. Then we want to get the people to check that they've understood and agree with what we've said, and then negotiate the order that they want to talk about them in. So again, we're learning about how they negotiate. We're learning, is someone trying to win the agenda and control the order that they're spoken about using neutral language. So I saw someone asked, well, can you put some values on the agenda rather than just saying communication? Do we say respectful communication? Look, it depends a bit on context. If you're putting respectful communication and one party's talked all about that and the other one hasn't, then is it a mutual agenda or is it siding with one side? Also, we don't want to be kind of mind reading what we think the solution is and putting that into our agenda. So we'll just slip in how they can solve it by putting that into the agenda. Less is generally more in terms of we don't want big long sentences. So usually 2 or 3 words is enough to be clear. If you've got someone who's very talks a lot and it's got a whole big list of things, we don't want to have you don't want an agenda with 10 things. One, it's impractical. You're not going to be able to get through everything. And it's probably that you're chunking too low. It's too detailed. So if you're hearing lots and lots and lots of issues, they may be just examples of a larger bucket that they fit into. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that? Particularly if anyone's already had a go with being a mediator. This is one of the trickier bits, I guess. It's all very, very clear and easy. And then in the run sheet with the parties' opening statements, it's got a little bit more guidance around that and creating the agenda. There's a little bit of skills that you'll be needing to use or teams. We've got a group that have workplace restrictions on using Zoom. If you need to use Teams instead, then we can coordinate that. But either way, that's a skill to be able to share the screen. We have our Friday session, so if you want to come along to one of those and say, hey, I'd like to have a little practice sharing a screen, we can do that. The same with putting people in the waiting room for private sessions. The easiest way is to pull up a plain Word document and write your agenda on that. Just remember not to default to a numbered list because you want to get the people to negotiate the order that they want to speak And again, just using patience and a facilitative approach. So, if they're both stuck on one particular item, doesn't really matter what order they go in. We're going to have enough time to talk about them. Where would you like to start? And just use your silence, sit back and let them sort it out. If someone suggests something, always check in with the other person until you've got agreement. Okay. Now you're ready to kind of take the reins off. Up until this stage, it's been one-to-one, or you're kind of dictating to the two of them. They haven't really been speaking directly, and you're wanting now to transition to them speaking directly. At this stage, you will choose who goes first. When we say the weaker party, there's a lot of ways you can consider the relative power of the people in the room. You've had a chance to see them negotiate who went first in the party's opening statements. You've seen them negotiating the order of the agenda or perhaps the agenda items. So that's given you, quite a few insights into how they interact. From that, you might decide this person doesn't talk as much, so it'd be good for them to go first. Or it may be positional power. One's a manager and the other an employee, so you might ask the employee to go first. Or if you may just decide the person opposite to whoever went first last time. It doesn't really matter, except if it does. If there is someone who's significantly weaker, it's always good for them to be able to get their thoughts out first, rather than having to kind of listen to the other person and perhaps defer to them.
Joanne, if we suggest that one goes first, does that create an impression that we might be not neutral? They typically don't care.
It doesn't, as long as we're not doing that every time. It's just, we generally will do it at this stage just so that we can give that person some clean air, I guess.
Yeah.
But when we get to private sessions, we'll usually just invite who'd like to go for a break first. But just where there's transition, because there's a reason that we want, we want to try and provide that opportunity for whoever it is. So now that you've got an agreed agenda, we can move on to the exploration stage. So I'm going to invite the two of you to speak directly to each other. Please remember the ground rules for respectful language and take turns. Don't interrupt each other. Really try and confirm your understanding before you respond. So, Sergio, could you tell Rowena a bit more about that first issue of the communication between the two of you? Perhaps share a little bit of the history of how things have evolved from your point of view. So we want to try and give them a bit of direction, and it depends on the issue how you might do that. Generally, we want to get a timeline flow. What's led up to this? What's the past? What's the history around this issue? What's going on now? After that's been explored, you might start to look at the future and option generation. You'd never start the exploration with Amanda, tell Beth what you think needs to happen to improve the communication. That's really shut down any opportunity to explore why things are the way they are. In mediation, almost inevitably, there's misunderstandings, there's missing information, things that people just don't know. When people are in conflict, their interpretations of the actions of others are more sinister. They give themselves a lot of benefits of the doubt or excuses for their bad behaviour, but anything that the other person's done, they'll generalise that into bad person sort of thing. Kind of human nature, it's what we do. And so we want to bring that back so they can rehumanise people. We don't start with how. So here in the run sheet, there's some there's some kind of prompting questions. You don't need to go through, you're not doing an interrogation. Remember, we're trying to get the parties to speak directly. Even in role plays, the students usually don't want to. If you are role playing, give the mediator the opportunity to redirect you. But, just you can't just be sitting in the sidelines and not involved as well. So you're going to be wanting to use some of your mediator skills to help keep the communication going, make sure that the conversation is productive, and also because ultimately you will be sitting in assessments. These practice role plays aren't assessments; they're practice role plays. Don't be concerned about getting feedback. Don't be concerned if your parties are going around in circles and you think I'm getting anywhere. You can always call a timeout and ask the mentor, where do I go here? And they'll be able to help you with that. So transitions, again, as I said, the weaker party, if you go, you could go with the applicant if you wanted to, but generally, it's however you think would be good to start. Facilitate direct communications through them. So providing that relevant history, the skills you're generally going to be using here. You might need to do respectful interruption. So sometimes people just talk. They might, provide a huge chunk of information that's too much. Look, can I just stop you there? Sorry to interrupt. That was a lot. I just made a note, but can we go back to that first point? I really wanted to see, Diane, how, and you might do a quick summary. How would you respond, or is that the way you thought things were, or whatever it is to bring the other person back into the conversation? When you're watching role plays, you should observe 2 or 3 role plays before you jump in as the mediator. Look for those little interruptions and things they do to get the conversation productive. Often what people will do, either through their personality or learned behaviour, is they'll debate, they'll negate, they'll try and put their point of view, or they'll pivot to their favourite topic. There's a bit of corralling and bringing people back to the focus that you might need to do. But again, being very careful not to fall into a question answer type pattern. I don't know if anyone's seen that happening, where the mediator's sort of forgotten what they're trying to do here, and they end up just asking questions and then they're getting their response back directly. So if you are coming in, you might do a little summary, you might redirect with a question, can you tell the other person? And then they might try and speak to you, so just gently redirect them back. Sometimes it can be excessive to let them say something and then redirect, otherwise you can really break rapport if it's over the top. Remaining impartial. Some of the things you might say in everyday conversation, you need to be really mindful of not doing as a mediator. If someone raises, starting to get into option generation, and someone raises something, and as the mediator you say, oh, that's a good idea. What have we done? We've evaluated. We said it's a good idea. It's one person's idea. The other one might think it's a terrible idea. Either way, we stepped out of our role. What would be a better way to deal with that, do you think?
You could say that's one option. What about some others?
Yeah. Or you just, throw it to the other person. Beckons just propose blah, blah, blah. What do you think, Paul? And, what are some other options? So here we want to be really generating as many options as we can, or, getting the people to come up with as many options as they can. The reason for that is people almost inevitably, as soon as they have a list, to start evaluating, start coming up with criteria, start thinking about why something might or might not work. Whereas if we, as the mediator, we're trying to get to an agreement, so if anything comes up, we'll pounce on it, and yes, and you've got agreement there. Generally, people are going to feel like it might be coerced, or it's unlikely to be the best outcome because it hasn't had any testing or rigor applied. We're just sort of collecting options at this point. It's ideal if you get some options out before the private sessions so that when you are speaking privately with people, you've got that opportunity to talk about the things that have been raised and whether they think they might be practical or not. So
Do you find it's more normal they discuss each issue and then do some options, or would they do the options within an issue?
sometimes kind of depends a little bit on the issues and the parties. So sometimes they may start sort of talking around in circles on a particular issue and you think, oh, we're really not getting anywhere. It's almost agree to disagree on perspectives. So you do a summary of each person's perspective and they say, look, just for the sake of time, I'd like to move on to the next item on the agenda. And so you kind of park that one without going into option generation, and then you'll do some option generation afterwards. But usually people will kind of organically start coming up with options. So don't kind of be distressed if they don't and think, I could get them to come up with options on this first agenda item. It's quite okay if they've plumbed the base on it and you think, oh, they're just going in circles now. I'll move them on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Yeah. So we don't need to feel stressed about forcing options at that stage. But we do definitely want to understand a little bit of the history of what's led up to it and a current understanding of the issues from each person's perspective. So using our pre-frame, you can use questions like, what would be, the ideal outcome from that particular option once you've they might say, oh, it's just so stressful at work. Like I feel like working from home. What would be the ideal situation for you? If you could share that with the other person, you want to give both the opportunity to respond to that type of question. So that often brings out a lot of information. You're wanting to use brainstorming, problem-solving skills. If people are identifying a problem, that maybe outside of them, or that's an opportunity for some of those sorts of questions you might ask. And of course, getting the interaction safe and appropriate, reminding people about using first names if they start to deviate away from that. Being mindful of your time. You need to demonstrate private sessions. I always have private sessions in my mediations because it's really important to check in with people. For anyone who's up to the conflict styles information in the course, it's very common that people have an avoidance style in conflict, whether it's personality, behaviour or fear related. Their approaches, we just won't talk about it. And that might make it go away. You may find that there's things that people need to say that they haven't said. And so private sessions is an opportunity to explore with them what would happen if you did say that, and perhaps identify their fears, or, what's going to happen if you don't share that information. So there's a lot we can do in the private session to move things along. They are confidential, and it's really important that you remind the person that it is a confidential process. That way they know they can speak openly with you. Generally, in the facilitative style of mediation, the mediator wouldn't be bringing back information from the private session, but you might coach the person, helping them to feel confident to bring back. So, perhaps they say, oh, well, I could tell them about that, but I'm not sure how to say it. Well, pretend I'm there. How would you say it to me? Just give them an opportunity to have a little practice. You might be reality testing, checking in with them, whether what's being proposed is reasonable, is practical. If they're really not coming up with many options so far, you might use Watner and Batner. What's the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement? If you can't reach agreement today, if you're not able to get this resolved, what might happen? What are the risks if this continues? as it is, or gets worse, or it might be that someone's kind of accepting things that, well, is that even appropriate? Are they, you might ask, well, if you don't reach an agreement, what's the best alternative to what's on the table at the moment? That there's a whole pile, and in the course there's more information as well, but things like a magic wand question. If you had a magic wand, if you were able to have any outcome at all, what would it be? So sometimes that can help take the limits off people's thinking. I'm in training myself at the moment for elder mediation. We were in role plays, and the mediator asked a magic wand question, and the older person whose husband had just died, I want my govern back. And so it didn't really work at all in that case. You need to be mindful about those types of things. Questions, comments about private sessions? Is everyone clear why we're doing them? What we're hoping to achieve?
Joanne, just a question. It must be very awkward though sometimes to run a private session, especially if you're on Zoom or in an environment where there's not sufficient breakout rooms.
Yeah.
So what would you do? Would you stop the mediation and restart on another day, those meetings separately, or what would be the strategy in that situation?
Well, on Zoom, it's easy because you can put them out in the waiting room, so you're able to talk privately, and you control it. You know exactly where people are at. In the real world, it's important that you mediate in an appropriate venue so that you are able to have those confidential discussions. That's something, so you don't want the person sitting on the other side of the wall in the waiting room with their ear pressed against the wall listening in. So if you are going to be doing in-person mediations, there's generally locations that are suitable. You might be able to hire a room from a mediator if you have offices, sometimes in libraries, sometimes other professional offices. And normally you take one person, escort them out to a waiting room and say, I'll come back out and get you. That's normally how you handle that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
With online, we put people outside of the meeting, and we can have a little practice of that on a Friday. The mentors will be able to help you with those technical skills, so you'll be comfortable doing that. If you're in the real world, if you're doing multi-party mediations, then what you'd normally do on Zoom, what I do is set up breakout rooms where you can put multiple people in the same room so they're able to talk with each other. I do a lot of family dispute resolution mediation, and often we do shuttle. There's been family violence, and with that, there might be a support person, and I'm going back and forward between those breakout rooms virtually. And if you're doing that sort of high conflict mediation, you'll need to have a venue that does have a suite of rooms so that you've got the other person not just out in a general waiting room, you've got them in another private space. But yeah, thank you for asking that. That's important to be aware of. So we generally, first thing, we want to help the person evaluate how the process is going. So usually a very simple question like, how's it going for you? And then just give them a moment to collect their thoughts. If you're someone who talks a lot, you might be uncomfortable with giving people the time to collect their thoughts. Some people might take longer than it's comfortable for you to sort of think through and come up with an answer. So that's something for us to get comfortable with. It's a really interesting response because sometimes you think, oh, I think this is going terribly. And they say, oh, it's so great. Like we never had such a good conversation. Oh my goodness. So, or others, you think it's going really well and you say, how's the mediation going for you? And they say, oh, it's terrible. I'm being forced into all of these things. People aren't always, they don't always show what's going on or say what's going on. It's harder online than in person, but even so, people, particularly if they are in a environment that's a bit unsafe, they get very, very good at hiding what they're thinking. It's important. This is confidential. I won't be sharing anything discussed with the other person in their private session or when we come back, but you'll be able to bring anything back how's the mediation going for you? All of those things, it depends on the context, but we're wanting to see that you're not just using 10 minutes to have a random chat. You're working towards achieving something. We are really looking at you being even-handed with the time allocation. One of the things around confidentiality means not taking notes during the private session. We apply that in the training when you're doing mediation online as well. If you are mediating in person, it's really, really important that you don't take notes during the private session because, lots of people are very adept at reading upside down. There's been incidents where someone's grabbed the mediator's book to see what they've written down. So generally you'd note down at the top, on your page, what time you started your mediation, your private session, what time you finished, just quickly work out how long it was. No, there might be a little bit of mucking around time between one private session and the next, and then note down the start and monitor the time. I'm someone who loses track of time. When I'm in it, I have to use my watch. You might be someone who's, very good at keeping track of time, and you'll work that out. While you're learning, it's good to just jot that down and then put your pen down. My trainers will give you a hard time if they see you taking notes. If you're not taking notes, just be mindful if someone's got something they want to bring back, that you encourage them to, make a note so they can remember what they were going to bring back. Okay. Any more questions or thoughts about private sessions? And you see we're calling it private sessions and option generation because you might be generating options here, particularly if they were stuck in the earlier sessions and you've had to remind them, if it's a workplace one, if you don't get this sorted, generally, if a workplace has invested money in people coming to mediation, it's pretty important that the issues get resolved. So I'm not sure what will happen in your workplace if the two of you can't work together. So what are some options that you might be able to bring back? We have to be mindful not to do this in a coercive way because as mediators, we've got a lot of power in the room as well. But it's important to do if someone's really caught up in the conflict and they're not thinking about the consequences of not getting things resolved. Those of you that are in workplace situations, it's not a long-term tenable situation if you've got managers or staff members that won't talk to each other, that are, necessary communication's got to go through a third person or something like that. It's not a long-term viable option that most businesses will put up with. Okay, so once we come out of those private sessions, this is where we want to really provide that opportunity to bring back. So we've said it's confidential at the start and at the end of each of the individual sessions. So we come back, okay, so thank you for that. I'm not going to bring anything back, but is there anything that either of you would like to say to each other? And again, this is another point where you just use your silence. Give them time to kind of reflect, gather their thoughts, and kind of just hold the space until they either say something or they say, no, I'm fine. Where would you go then if no one's bringing anything back?
Back to the agenda by any chance?
Yeah, spot on. That's a great place. If you pick something, they might be thinking, was that something that was discussed in the private sessions? Why has the mediator gone there? Go back to the agenda, or you might go back to the last thing that was being discussed before the private sessions, but generally going back to the agenda is a good place to start. Now what you're wanting to do is start, looking at those options, helping the parties to evaluate, consider proposals. If there's some more things that have come out of the private sessions. You want to ask some reality testing questions. Would that solve the problem? Is it workable? Are you committed to it? Is there something you'd be committed to implementing? You'll be making some notes at this point. Things are starting to move towards, hopefully, moving towards some points of agreement. You might be asking some contingency questions, some what if type questions. Let's say we're going to have a meeting at 5 a.m. every Monday. What if one of you isn't at work that day? What happens then? We just might run a meeting that week, or we'll run it the next day with it. Yeah. So you're kind of working through there. Maintaining impartiality is not evaluating the options, getting the parties to evaluate them, and making sure that one party is not dictating everything as much as you can, not providing advice or opinions, and trying to identify and manage potential abuses of power or exploitation of vulnerabilities. This can be hard because vulnerabilities are also realities. Really making sure that people are not being bullied into a situation. Perhaps they need more time, perhaps they need more information, that type of thing. Sometimes as a student, you're sort of thinking, I need an agreement to show that I'm a good mediator. You actually don't really need an agreement, and an agreement may be that they're going to get more information, or that there's some interim things that can be done. Don't let that cause you stress that you're kind of coercing people into something. From the point of view of this presentation, we're looking at the point of bringing back, we're using reality testing type questions. Sometimes we're using reframes. A reframe is a question or a statement, or using our language skills to help people to look at alternative ways of thinking. There's a whole pile of different ways we can reframe things, and there's some content around that in the course. It might be a temporal reframe. You might ask, how would you like things to be in 6 months from now, or in the longer term? Maybe they're thinking too long term. In the short term, what could you do right now? Maybe getting people to look from other perspectives. Who else might be impacted? How will what you're proposing fit in with them? Really just any way that you get people to change the perspective that they're taking, that's going to help reframe. And, you want to, again, use your agenda. I said before not to have a whole lot of agenda items. You also don't want to have one agenda item. If you've done that, you've chunked too high and really need more detail to work with and get people to look at other aspects of their issues. Some of those reframes and perspective taking can help with overcoming deadlocks. Once you get to the agreement writing, in this style of mediation, you're really wanting the parties to dictate how they want the agreement to be written. Make sure that both parties are agreeing, not just one party dictating the terms and words of the agreement. If that starts to happen, check in. It may be that they're both happy to do that. If that was how it was starting to happen, I'd acknowledge it. It sounds like everything, all of the words are coming from Nicole. Is that okay with you, Diane? Was that working for you? And then, oh, no, that's fine. Maybe Diane will say, let me get a word in. Again, there's some content in the course about legal status of agreement. Generally, an agreement reached in mediation isn't going to be legally binding. There's legislation that makes it enforceable. Farm debt mediation's one example. That's mediation with banks around debt. There's some cooling off provisions, but there's also some enforceability provisions there. In other situations, it's generally going to be able to be used as evidence, but depending on the context, sometimes an agreement reached may be considered a contract, and people will try and enforce them. So it sounds a bit wishy-washy when you're telling people you might need to get some advice about that, but it does depend on the context. Generally, the agreement is more of a moral agreement. This is reminder of what the two of you have agreed to do. You could sometimes, depends on, again, on the context, you could have a pre-frame in your agreement a template that says this agreement is not intended to be enforceable or is intended to be evidence of our commitment to apply this agreement. Generally, we leave it more open and just have the things that people have said they'll do and expect that they'll do it. You might ask if do you need a dispute resolution clause? What happens if you don't agree about what you've agreed should be done? Do you want to have anything in there about checking in? So we can raise those sorts of things, not dictating, okay, you need to have a clause that if you can't agree, you've got to come back to mediation with me. Or, you have to check in with me in 3 months. That wouldn't be ethical or appropriate, but you can ask if they needed some clauses around those types of things. Any questions or comments around that documenting agreement process? Again, we'd pull up a Word document, type into it. Sometimes people are thinking, oh, I'm not very confident about my typing, I'll just pre-type it all. No, it really should be dictated by the parties and in their words. And then the close of the mediation, it's pretty brief and formulae. We want to summarise the process, any steps regarding the agreement that have been agreed to, are there need for any additional sessions, restate whatever was agreed regarding confidentiality. In some of your situations, like some of your workplace situations, the context may be that the agreement's going to be shared with HR or with the manager that's referred people to mediation. So you should be raising that at the agreement writing point of time. So that people remember that this is going to be shared with externally. So often there's situations where people have been disrespectful to each other. They may make apologies, but they may not want that written down in the agreement. Part of your role would be checking in to make sure that they understand the context of what they're writing. And you're wanting to use your skills to make sure that their agreement is well documented. So who's doing what and when and how, those sorts of questions you're going to be asking to make sure that when they come back to the agreement in a week's time, they know what actually was meant. So there you are. It's a very simple process. With the certificate of training, you've got to do 6 role plays as a role player and 3 as a mediator. The same for the NMAS requirements. Generally, what we want you to do is do 2 or 3 as a role player first before you do any as a mediator. 3 is ideal, but sometimes the scheduler is a little bit hard to get in either way. You definitely want to do some as a role player, and you don't want to do all of your role plays as a role player first. The learning process is a lot better if you alternate between being a mediator and being a role player. After you've been a mediator, jump back into being a role player. You'll find that the feedback you got is going to integrate a lot better if you do things that way. Any questions about that, either the process or that structure? In the course, you've got access to the AMDAS. For anyone that's on the NMAS course, it's really good to go through to the AMDAS because it goes into a little bit more detail about the professional skills. With some of these skills, like the active listening, summaries, reframes, reflections, reported speech, respectful interruptions, they're all skills that once you hone them as a mediator, you'll find you're using them in all sorts of places. I'd encourage you to use them now with your family or, anyone in your day-to-day. Just perhaps pick a skill that you're going to focus on practicing for the day, and so that they become second nature. And also maybe do a little bit of a skills audit on yourself, particularly once you've done some role plays, and think, what are the things that I find more challenging, and really focus on getting more practice on that. The recordings, members. If you haven't got a login, apply for a student membership. It's free, and then that will give you access. Once you're logged in, there's a whole pile of other recordings as well. So the course-specific recordings should be in the course. And for anyone who's thinking of setting up a professional practice, you'll find a number of recordings on business development and practice management and things like that as well that I'd encourage you to have a look at.
You can attend events while you're a student.
Just get your login and then you can attend any of those. The reflection review sessions are on Friday at the moment, so they're at 12 Eastern time. And they're an opportunity to kind of talk about the practicalities of the role plays that you're participating in, observing, any questions you've got about the course. Often, if there's some patterns that we're seeing, we might have a brief tutorial on a particular topic, but it's generally much more of a conversation